This Stealing the Mind Bible Conference presentation is by Daniel Currier and is entitled Why Capitalism versus Socialism is God versus Satan. For a free catalog of hundreds of awesome Bible studies available on DVD video and audio CD, call Compass at 800-977-2177 or download and watch now at our website, compass.org.
Thanks, Bill. Wow. Let's see if we can get this going here. Well, I do want to do a quick shout out to Bill and his team. They did a great job, or doing a great job this weekend, so I do want to say thank you. So about 400 years ago or so, in the 1600s, early 1600s, there was a man named William Bradford. And William Bradford is this guy up here. And he left England. He left England to Holland. He was being persecuted by King James, the same King James as the King James Bible, and he wanted religious freedom. And he went to Holland. He found that Holland was too worldly, and so him and his crew, his fellow believers, they came to the New World to start a new colony. This happened in about 1620, 1621 or so. When they came to the new colony in 1621, 1622, it was a painful experience for them. It was failure and discouragement, death and sickness. And they had this big problem. By 2 years later, 1623 and 1624, they started exporting products. What happened between those two periods of time? When they were starving almost, and a couple years later, they were having excesses that they could export. Well, when they first started their colony, they had their food and land in common, and they all worked together. Well, there were some problems. There was this caused discontentment, unhappiness, discouragement, a lot of fighting and stuff like that. A decreased productivity. The hard workers did not think it was fair that they had to do the same job, they had to do harder work than as the people that did not work as much, but everyone got the same amount of clothing and food and everything else like that. The single guys didn't want to work for their families without pay, all right? They wanted pay. Well, the ladies, the married ladies, they didn't want to be sewing and feeding the single guys. They thought that was a form of slavery. Well, Bradford, he wrote in his journal, he said this. He's like, those who think that this way is a good way must think that they're wiser than God, which is a kind of a strange statement. And he goes, this way is after the conceit of Plato. Well, what happened in those 4-year period of time, they changed from a public ownership where everybody owned everything as a community, and they changed it to more of a private system. And that really did help him out. So, about me, like Bill said, I was raised in a Christian home all my life, and I went to college. I have a background in technology and biology. I do not have a background in history, economics, political science, anything like that, so that's kind of strange I'm speaking about this, but this topic has been quite interesting for me for years now. Probably for the last 15, 20 years now, I've been researching it. And I do speak on and write on apologetics, which is giving a defense for our faith. And so this is definitely part of in that category because it is a worldview that is opposed to the Christian worldview, interestingly enough. I write over at iApologia, and I have Facebook pages and Twitter account there as well. In college, about college age, I read the Communist Manifesto. I thought it may deceive me or cast a spell of deception over me. I wasn't too impressed. I would encourage everyone to read the Communist Manifesto. I really would. I think everyone should be reading that book. Whether you like communism or not, or socialism or not, because it really puts in perspective what Marx was saying, and especially when compared to the Christian worldview, is pretty radical stuff. And I'll be pointing some of that out as we go along here. But today, let's just go fast forward to today. Communism, not communism specifically, because that kind of a bad name, but socialism is such a positive thing in today's culture, right? I mean, we all hear about socialism and stuff like that. So woke, so hip, so cool, right? I mean, this is just a cool thing to believe. It sounds so right, so just, so equal. And in fact, it sounds so biblical. Think of Acts. I mean, who's for poverty? Who's for being selfish? You know, I mean, it sounds like a really, really good thing. Even in today's politics, AOC really supports socialism. But it's not just her. Bernie Sanders, Michael Moore, the Occupy Wall Street, Senator Cory Booker. I read an article where he wants to give poor kids $50,000 by the time they graduate high school. Another guy who was I'm not sure if he's going to be a presidential running in the Democratic Party, his name is Andrew Yang, and he wants the government to give everyone in the United States between, I think it's like 18 and 62 or something like that, about $12,000 a year just to live, just to live. Where did it come from? Where did this idea come from? As we talked about Bradford's journal, he talked about Plato. Plato lived about 400 years before Christ. He was a Greek philosopher. He wrote the Republic, and one of the stories in there, he talked about the guardian class. And in the guardian class, they had a society where they shared everything, economically, land, food, everything like that. But it's not just that. It was also they had like no marriages, so like you just, is open. That was open too. Shared spouses, shared children, type of thing. So it was really weird ideas that he was putting forth. His ideas eventually became the blueprints for the welfare state. Fast forward a few hundred years, and we come to Karl Marx in the 1800s. Now, there's a lot of people in that time frame that thought this type of idea was a good idea, but Marx really put this whole socialism, Marxism, communism thing into motion. He was a big player, his ideas. And as you know, he did write the Communist Manifesto, and we'll be looking at some of that. But let's first get some definitions down here. Marxism. Jeff Myers, from his book Understanding the Times, defines Marxism as this. He says it's atheistic and materialistic, meaning that they don't believe in a supernatural being. He wanted the abolition of private property, that's what Marxism is, and the public ownership of the means of production or of businesses and stuff like that. He had this utopian communistic idea, the state. So what does communism mean? It's a classless, stateless, utopian society. Property is owned by everyone. Everyone is paid according to their needs. And lastly, socialism. Socialism has two main components. Number one is that the society as a whole, culture, owns the means of production as a whole. The second thing is that distribution of goods and services. And this becomes very important. This definition will be very important as we go along here, those two items there. I do want to note that fascism is a very close kin to this. Interestingly, I don't think education today really notes it as well, but fascism does have severe economic controls from the government onto to businesses, and it's extreme social regulation. They think that the society in general is greater than the individual, enforceable suppression and opposite to those who oppose. Also, there's another idea that comes out of Marxism, and that is postmodernism. You probably have heard that term before. If you have, it's a pretty dangerous view where that we don't have access to truth. But one of the ideas in there is that there's this political power play where there's always like the poor and the rich are at war with each other. That's how it connects with Marxism, by the way. But it's not just that. It's also the underdog is at war with the rich person, or the homosexual is being oppressed by the straight person, or the woman by the man, or the man by the woman, or the black by the white, or the white by the black, or the Asian by the... So everyone's always at this conflict with each other. So that's how it connects with Marxism. So thinking about Marxism, thinking about Marx, what was Marx thinking when he came up with this idea? What was in his mind? Now, I'm not 100% sure if he ever stepped a foot into a factory. Even though his finance Engels did own, or actually he was a heir to a factory that his father owned. His father was a capitalist, interestingly enough. And it's which funded Marx's endeavors, but whatever. But what was in Marx's head? Well, he did bring up some very interesting points that were true. Like any worldview, there is some truth to what he was saying. And a lot of the factories were dangerous, poor factory conditions. There was some problems there. Slave-like working conditions, yes. Employees had no voice. They did not have voice. They had these menial jobs, and they almost had this micromanagement type of mentality. Everybody was managing them really closely. This picture is actually not in the 1800s. This was taken in the 1900s, early 1900s, and this was happening in the United States as a little girl in a factory. And by that time, it was outlawed. Like, you shouldn't have kids working in factories, but a lot of factories were still doing it. He seemed to be a little bit of a Luddite. A Luddite is someone who, to put it simply, opposes technological advances. And as you read his books and his writings, he seems to be kind of against progress. He assumed a stagnant class mobility, so if you're poor, you'll be poor all your life, and your kids will be poor. And he also assumed a stagnant wealth pie size, which means that there's only X amount of money in the world type of thing, and the rich get most of it, and the poor get almost nothing. Now, if you read his book, I'm going to point out a bunch of things that he notes, and this is interesting. He promotes the abolition of private property. When he's saying private property here, he's not necessarily talking about your house, even though it could be. It's usually talking about business, land, extra besides just what you're living on. He was against individuality and freedom, free trade. He was opposed to family, interestingly enough. He was opposed to home education, marriage, countries and nationality, and religion. And that included Christianity. Some of these phrases were taken verbatim from his book, by the way. So some of them were not, but this is pretty much what he believed. He also, interestingly enough, taught about the idea that the Marxist, the socialist, is going to have to rise up against the bourgeoisie, and they're going to have to wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie, which means the rich factory owners. And he says this, of course, at the beginning, this cannot be affected except by means of despotic inroads, meaning pretty much authoritarian control. You have to pretty much take over and take control. This picture is actually in the Korean War, and it's a USGI who was he was probably one of his fellow soldiers probably just died or something like that. It's a very sad situation there. Marx's 10 planks. This is the famous or infamous 10 planks you may have heard before. So I'm not going to go through them all, but these are the things that he thought were good things that any country who wants to excel at being communistic needs to incorporate all these things. And these are just 5 of them. I'll give you the next 5 in a second here. But things like abolition of private property, centralization of banks. He wants centralization of communication and transportation, free public education. These are just some of them. Again, this is the abridged version. There's a longer version out there. Okay, so that's Marxism in a nutshell. That's Marx's ideas. And this is what this is the formula, this is the basis, this is the bedrock for socialism, Marxism, and communism. Marx's ideas. Okay, let's switch to capitalism. What's capitalism? Where did it come from? Et cetera, et cetera. Capitalism, old, white, rich, selfish men, right? No. Actually, where did capitalism come from? A lot of people think it came about 500 years ago. Actually, it didn't. It came about around in the 800s in monastic estates. And what happened was that a lot of these monasteries, they were trying to figure out how to keep themselves afloat economically. They wanted to do really, really well and not be stressed out about financial issues. So they started more of a system where they could ensure economic stability. So what's capitalism? Quick definition. Capital assets are privately owned, and there is competition within the free market. You need freedom. You need free global trade. You need property rights and property titles. This is huge. I'll get into more why later. The rule of law, but you also want limited governments. You need people who are hardworking and want to make things. That's a very needed thing for capitalism. Again, this definition comes from Jeff Myers' Understanding the Times book. So what helped the rise of capitalism? Interestingly enough, the collapse of the Roman Empire. So Rome, it collapsed in 400 or 500? And a few hundred years later, a couple hundred years later, we saw the rise of capitalism. But Rome was oppressive. They're a tyrannical state. They discouraged progress. We hear a lot of positive things about Rome, but if you read about them, yeah, they did have some cool technology. And they do some good stuff, but a lot of the things they did was quite crazy, too. Collapse of slavery. Okay. Almost every society on planet Earth had slavery until Christianity came along. Why? Because in Christianity, slavery doesn't fit, all right? It just doesn't fit well at all. Now, are there people that claim to be Christians that did own slaves? Yes. But in Christian doctrine, it just does not fit. How can you go have communion and go worship with your slave that you're a master over, but he's your brother in Christ? It doesn't make sense. And so it pretty much collapsed. It just kind of fell in on itself. Also, there's an economic point to it, too, is that slaves, once you bought a slave, you had to continue to feed and take care of that slave. But an employee, you can pay as long as you need them, and then when you're done needing that employee, you can let him or her go. And so it was economically a lot better idea to have employees, workers. Tribute collapsed. Rome was notorious for tribute. It collapsed, and it went more towards a free trade or a trade type of system. Interestingly enough, there was this promotion of progress during the Middle Ages. Western civilization grew out of the Middle Ages, based upon Christian ideology, by the way. The arts increased. Technology just blossomed. University was started by Christians, by the way. Technology, like I said before, science. Science was started in the Middle Ages. By who? By the Christians, again. Wealth increased. Philosophy got a lot more robust. Farming, a lot better farming ideas came about through the Middle Ages. There's a great hoax that goes around, and this comes from Rodney Stark's book. If you ever get a chance to read some of Rodney Stark's work, do it. He's an intellectual, but he's quite interesting how he writes. But he said this, is that Dark Ages is a hoax. He says this, that the idea of ignorance, superstition, and misery and being rescued by the Enlightenment and Renaissance is a hoax. Now, here's the thing. Actually, this was started by the intellectuals of I think it was the 18th century intellectuals who were pretty bitter against Christianity. There may have been a Dark Ages. So the whole Dark Ages thing is a hoax, but there may have been a physical Dark Ages, not a ignorance type of Dark Ages. There may have been a volcano that blew in the 500s that may have, actually, as some of the historians read about the Middle Ages, they read about that there was a time during the 500s where the sun did not give forth its brightness. They had some evidence that it seems to be a big volcano that blew. And so there might have been a physical Dark Ages, and it did cause a lot of famine and culture conflict and plagues and stuff like that. More about Christianity affecting things. Unique Christian conviction that progress was a God-given obligation. The gift of reason was very important. He keeps pounding away in his book, The Victory of Reason. He said that new technologies, techniques would always be forthcoming. This is a fundamental Christian faith. Progress, pro-reason, pro-technology. He goes on to say that no Western churches condemned technology on religious grounds. Pro-technology, pro-progress, innovations, especially in the monastic estates, were just blossoming at this time. Also, there was a promotion of transportation. We hear a lot about the Roman roads, and the Roman roads were a great idea, except for the fact that they weren't as great as a lot of people say they were. They were poor road designs in the Middle Ages. They made the road designs better. In fact, they started making bridges during the Middle Ages, and they made carts, horse and ox-drawn carts, that not only had swiveling front axles, they didn't have that in the Roman times, by the way, but they also had brakes on them. So if you're going downhill, you could carry bigger loads. And they also had better horse harnesses that they didn't have during the Roman times, so horses could do a lot more than some of the other animals could do. Ronnie Stark says that innovations were spread by transportation, by this increase in transportation, better than the Roman times. Also, education. There was more education for the masses during the Middle Ages. University was started, I told you that before, but also there was more literacy for the general public. This is quite interesting. Kind of goes against our today's culture's milieu about Middle Age education. Actually, predominantly Roman Catholic nations, and this is probably between the 1500s to 1900s is kind of where I'm kind of aiming at. Predominantly Roman Catholic nations had a literacy rate of about 40 to 60%. Protestants had about 94 to 99 some percent. Almost 100% of the population was literate, and that came down to the Protestant idea of everybody should read the Bible. But pre-Christian Greco-Roman, pre-Christian India and Chinese cultures, 0 to 20% were literate. So literacy really blossomed during the Middle Ages as well. There's some other things that helped too. There's a switch to a cash economy. There's less barter. It started making banks, easier lending and credit. There's interest. You can make money off of your money now if we could loan it out to people. Promotion of work. Work was a virtue. In the Roman times, work was not a virtue. Your slaves did the work. Virtue, if you wanted to sit around, you want to take it easy. Well, the capitalistic mindset is that work is a virtue. And that comes from the Christian worldview as well, that we should work. Encouraged the rule of law. You need morality and ethics. You needed to have, you did not want to fear for your life. You did not want to fear for your property. So you want a system over top of you that's going to protect you. Free markets. You needed the government to stay out of the markets. You wanted to be able to freely trade as you could. You want that freedom. Property rights, we talked about this before. You had to have something. If you don't have property rights, why would you invest? Why would you increase technology? Why would you build on? There's no reason to, because someone else can come along and just take your stuff. You need to have that property rights. Economic security. We talked about this with the monastic estates. And lastly, self-responsibility. There is another phrase that you could use, self-sufficiency. You could use self-interest. This is not selfishness. That's an evil thing. You should not be selfish. But self-interest, self-responsibility is where you take care of yourself. That's a good thing to take care of yourself. That's what we try to do with our kids, don't we? Aren't you excited when your 2-year-old can do all sorts of things for him or herself, right? Or the 1-year-old? We try to get kids to do things for themselves. Why? Because we want to succeed, but also we don't want them to be being waited on by other people. So, with these two big worldviews going on here, which way do we go? So we come to the fork in the road. Which way? So I'm going to give you a rubric of 3 points. And that's the biblical idea, running through a biblical worldview. We're running through a pragmatic, rational worldview. And lastly, a idea of history, what has happened in history. So these 3 things are going to be really important from here on out. Number 1 is the biblical criteria. Interestingly enough, Marxism opposes Christianity at almost every single level. There's this ex-communist in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I forget which exact year he lived. His name was Douglas Hyde, and he used to be a communist for like 20 years, and he became a Christian. And he said this: the communists have the worst creed on earth, and they shout it from the housetops. Too often, those of us who get the best creed speak it with muted voices, if we speak at all. He said that communism was opposed to Christianity, and they have a really bad message, and we have the greatest message. We're quiet, but it's opposed to Christianity. the two totally different messages. And here's the reason why it's opposed to Christianity. These 11 points right here. There might be more as well. I'm not going to go through them all, but look at some of them. Private property versus public property. Private property is assumed in the Christian worldview. Materialism versus supernaturalism. Marx was a materialist. Socialism and communism is based upon materialism. Family abolition. Yes, he was very for abolishing the family. Well, obviously that's quite anti-biblical. But here's the crux of the matter. Let's just distill it down to one main thing. I think that the crux of the matter is it's immoral. And it's immoral because it's theft. It takes from some to give to others. And a lot of times the person taking gets some of it as well. Think about it this way. It's a rejection of God's greatest laws of loving God and loving others. If you would love God and others, would you lust and covet their property? If you loved God and others, would you steal and be a thief? If you loved God and others, would you rise up in revolution because of your lust for the other person's property and murder them to take their property? No. So this is quite opposed to the Christian worldview. I mean, we look through the Bible. From the very beginning to the very end, it talks about private property and theft, okay? Pro-private property from the very beginning. I mean, think about it this way. Thou shalt not steal. It assumes private property. We can go all the way to the New Testament. Paul, Jesus, Peter, all promote either private property or that we should not steal. So this is very anti-biblical. Here's the thing. If you don't understand this, well, I'm sure and hopefully all you do, that's sharing up there, and that's theft at the bottom, all right? And usually the person taking it, the government entity, usually takes a little bit for themselves as well. Okay, here I'm going to quote an atheist. Even the atheist knows about this idea. Has anybody heard of Penn Jillette? He's a magician, Penn and Teller show. He's not a socialist, interestingly enough. He's more of a libertarian. He says this, helping poor and suffering people is compassion. He's all for helping poor and suffering people, sure. But he says this, voting for our government to use guns to give money to help poor and suffering people is immoral, self-righteous, bullying, laziness. He goes on to say this, there is no great joy in helping people. There is great joy in helping people, but no joy in doing it at gunpoint. So even an atheist knows what I'm saying here. All right, so that's criteria number one. Let's go into the pragmatic criteria, criteria number two that we want to look at. The rational side of this whole story. Rationally, it slows progress, if you think about it. It slows technology, the progress of technology, discourages investment in industry. It also confuses relative and absolute poverty and wealth. I just had experience just a couple days ago on the plane where my person I was standing next to was confusing this absolute and absolute poverty and relative poverty. Marxism makes people worse, which I'll tell you why. Capitalism actually funnels people who are selfish into the good of others. And Marxism opposes the human mind or the human nature. Why I love, quote-unquote, stinking rich people, okay? I don't know where this idea that rich people are bad. I think rich people are great. I mean, rich people make technology go mainstream. I have a car, I have a Toyota, and the technology in my car is like cool technology compared to like 20 years ago or whatever. I would not have it in there if someone did not lead the way and invent that and then put it in some nicer cars. And now I have it in my little Toyota. Investing is great. It drives the economy and capital. It's very important. Employment, it provides more jobs. When I was in high school, I had a job from a fellow neighbor. And he was probably the only neighbor in my neighborhood that could really afford me to work 20 some hours a week. All I did was take care of his property. He had hundreds of acres probably, and I had to mow a lot of it. No one else would have paid me money to do that. So that's pretty cool. Importance of private property, we talked about that before a little bit. It encourages progress, industry, and investment. I mean, think about this. If you don't have private property, why invest? Why build up? Why get new technology. What system do you want? One that encourages hoarding and stealing, or one that encourages frugality and investments? Here's the deal. We are evil, but we are also noble as humans, as a human nature. We need a system that takes the greedy human nature and funnels it for the good of others versus a system that encourages greed and makes it worse. Capitalism funnels bad people's motives and desires into the good of all. Marxism does the opposite and makes bad people worse. Even Jay Richards, he's a philosopher, and he wrote the book Money, Greed, and God, and he says this, socialism does not fit the human condition. Rather, it channels selfishness into social destructive behavior, like stealing, hoarding, and getting the government to steal for you. He goes on to say this, capitalism is for real, fallen, limited human beings, and it does not require greed. But if there is greed involved, it funnels it into desirable outcomes. Adam Smith from the 1700s makes a very similar point in his book. Aristotle, he points out this. What's common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. This is just common sense. You buy a car versus, maybe your parents' car. Well, you take care of your own car because you spent, $10,000 or $15,000 for it. But if your parents' car, like, oh, whatever, it's their car, if I mess it up, right? Reason number 3. Socialism works so well that people build boats from trash to escape it. Here's the thing. It's never worked. Venezuela. Item number 1, Venezuela. It's in the news right now. It's a failure. North Korea, failure. Russia, failure. China, failure. Plymouth Plantation, failure. All right? What's the history of the both? Well, Marxism is from Greek philosophy, which is not necessarily bad, but it was not necessarily a Christian ideology for sure. And it comes from Marx's atheistic viewpoints of selfishness, lust, and theft. Capitalism comes from the Christian worldview, and it's based upon Christian principles such as hard work, honesty, private property, rule of law, stable families, etc. Again, the same quote from AOC that we saw before. To me, what socialism means is to guarantee a basic level of dignity. Well, here's the dignity. Is this the dignity she's talking about? I don't know. Making everyone equally poor since 1917. How about this one? The Soviet famine, Chinese famine, the Cambodia famine. How about Venezuela today? This is about a year ago. I found these numbers. I checked recently. I think the numbers are very similar. But there's mass poverty, obviously, in Venezuela. That's still true. The economics of there is imploding. That's true. But it's approximately about 2,000 people are leaving per day from Venezuela. I'm assuming that's still true. I don't know for sure. But that was, I think, legal immigration, by the way, too. I'm not sure if there's illegal immigration. Also, socialistic, communistic governments usually either grow, they don't usually shrink, usually, or they turn totalitarian. And if they do implode, they usually turn to some sort of free market system, but they still have that totalitarian bent. Item number 1 is China. Here's a guy on Twitter. His name is Mark Antona. And he said this: real socialism has never been tried like the same way that real capitalism has never been tried. The difference is this: real socialism, or actually, the almost socialism resulted in the impoverishment and death of hundreds of millions of people, while almost capitalism has lifted billions from absolute poverty. This is true. I can give you the numbers on this from private news agencies that say this, all the way to governmental agencies are saying, yes, billions of people are being pulled out of poverty throughout the world. Last 30 years especially, billions of people have been pulled out of poverty. This is something that is amazing and good because of capitalism. If nothing else, our main concern with Marxism is the death it's caused. I mean, if by no other, you should think and look at the numbers. And actually, these numbers are kind of low. All these numbers are low, even for Islam, because Islam was up there. But it's probably closer to more, either 100 million people died, 100 million people 100 million people, that's a lot of people, right? Like close to 100 million people died because of Marx, up to 200 million people. It just depends on which numbers you look at, because no one knows for sure. Islam, that number actually is quite low, even though that's not part of this talk. It's probably closer to maybe 600 or 700 million since Islam started. All right, so let's just talk about a few objections that some people may have against what I'm saying here. The main objection I hear is this: Nordic countries, what about the Nordic countries? Aren't they socialist and aren't they doing really well? Well, it so happens that they do kind of have a welfare state that's based upon socialistic principles, but it's not quite socialism. And even that, it's going to be hard to sustain long term. This guy named Jeffrey Dorfman, he wrote in Forbes, he said this: "It is certainly true that Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark are notable economic successes. What is false is that these countries are particularly socialist." He goes on to say this: "They're basically free market economies with high taxes exchanged for generous government entitlement programs." So they do have an aspect of socialism, but they're not true socialism in the sense that they do not have government ownership of business. Here's the president or the prime minister of Denmark, and he says this: "Denmark is far from a socialistic planned economy. Denmark is a market economy." And he was saying this in opposed to Bernie Sanders' claim that they were socialist. What about Acts? The book of Acts, Acts 2 through 5, it talks about how they had everything in common, right? Well, here's the point about Acts. Number one, it is describing a situation that the Jerusalem church was going through, where they pooled their money together to help people. It was a description, it's a story. It wasn't prescribed, it's never commanded in the Bible, number one. Number two, it seemed like it's only a short time that it was even implemented. It seemed like it's almost like an emergency response type of thing. There was no forced redistribution. Everyone freely gave, as you can read in the book of Acts. It's a believer-based system only. There's no secular government involved. So there's no forced redistribution by the government. It's only a believer-based system. How about this one? I see this meme online. It says this: but, talking to Jesus here, one of the apostles, but, if you feed everyone, Jesus, wouldn't that be, gasp, socialism? No. If Jesus robs one group of people at gunpoint in order to feed a group of people who will vote for him, then yeah, that's more like socialism. But no, Jesus wasn't doing that. He was freely giving of his own. Actually, this would be what he probably would say. I told you to feed the poor, not create laws to steal from people to do it. How about this one? They didn't do it correctly. Here's the thing. I keep hearing this from people, and I don't know why. They didn't know how to implement socialism or communism correctly. If you think this, you probably most likely know less about communism, socialism, and Marxism than those who actually lived it and breathed it. Not only that, but these guys read it. Like they read the Communist Manifesto, they read Marx, all of Marx's books, they read Stalin, all that other stuff. If you think this, you're quite unaware of your incompetence. Thus, you're probably some of the most dangerous people on planet Earth, okay? Knowing almost next to nothing, and you'll probably run the system to oblivion. Everyone else gets hurt doing that. Yeah. They did it the wrong way. No, there's no right way. You can't do it. Seven things every kid needs to hear. I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I'm listening. Communism has failed every time it's tried. You've got what it takes. You want to say thank you?
This has been Why Capitalism versus Socialism is God versus Satan, presented by Daniel Currier. To receive a free catalog of hundreds of awesome Bible studies on DVD video and audio CD, all using and defending a literal translation of the Bible, information on upcoming Bible conferences in your area, or details of our missionary outreach and trips to Israel, call Compass at 800-977-2177 24 hours a day, or visit us on the web at compass.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook. Search facebook.com/Compass Bible.